Tonight we begin with a mutiny that Kremlin officials had feared, dismissed, and dreaded all at once. A rebellion that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere hours. Hours that shattered the myth of Putin's unquestioned control. Hours that exposed fractures within Russia's military command. Hours that brought armed forces within striking distance of Moscow itself. What Yevgeny Prigozhin did today crossed a line that Vladimir Putin had believed would never break, and when that line shattered, the Kremlin did not respond with strength. They responded with panic, confusion, and desperate negotiations. For months now there had been signals, not from official Kremlin sources, not from state media, just whispers, that Prigozhin was preparing something unprecedented. Prigozhin has been vocal, yes, but he has been calculated in his defiance. His public attacks on Russian military leadership followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a strategy, but what set off alarm bells in Western intelligence agencies this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Wagner Group communications know the indicators. The encrypted radio chatter, the supply chain movements, the troop repositioning near Rostov, the sudden disappearance of Prigozhin from public view, all of that went quiet. And whenever Prigozhin goes quiet, it means something is about to get very, very loud. Early this morning, intelligence sources detected what they described as unprecedented military convoy movements, including Wagner armored columns that had not been mobilized in this formation since the battle for Bakhmut. These are the kinds of assets that Prigozhin only deploys when he is signaling something very specific: defiance, territorial control, or direct confrontation. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Wagner was changing posture, and when a private military force with over 25,000 battle-hardened soldiers shifts posture without explanation, even by a small measure, every intelligence agency on Earth pays attention. The response issued by the Kremlin tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic. And it was desperate. Source after source described Prigozhin's move as treasonous, unprecedented, and perhaps, most importantly, genuinely threatening to Putin's grip on power. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Prigozhin did not. In fact, his response today was among the most audacious military moves we've seen in modern Russian history. Here's what we know. Within hours of declaring his march on Moscow, Prigozhin seized control of Rostov-on-Don. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were strategic captures, a military headquarters and communication centers that Wagner only targets when they are preparing to challenge the Russian state itself. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Wagner forces launched coordinated operations on key military installations, including the Southern Military District headquarters that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive operations. Wagner moved before the Russian military could mount any coherent counter-response. They seized the military headquarters. They blocked major highways leading to Moscow. They neutralized communication systems that were likely preparing to coordinate a defensive response. In other words, Wagner targeted the command infrastructure of Russia's southern military operations, the nerve center that would have coordinated any response against them. This is what made the Kremlin's panic so visible. Prigozhin's move wasn't just symbolic, it was operational. It represented the kind of direct challenge that could topple governments if left unchecked. And Putin, understanding that fully, responded not with force, not with military might, but with negotiations. He didn't send tanks. He didn't order airstrikes on his own territory. He sent intermediaries. He offered deals. And here's where the story becomes even more extraordinary. Intelligence analysts now believe that Prigozhin's march was designed to test the loyalty of Russian military units after months of public feuding with Defense Minister Shoigu. Prigozhin wanted to see whether Russian soldiers would fire on Wagner forces, but instead, something remarkable happened. Russian military units didn't engage. They stood down with a coordination so complete, so telling that even Kremlin loyalists noticed. Crow, you don't get that kind of passive response accidentally, but today, Prigozhin did. Military analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described the Russian military's hesitation as symptomatic, when a sign of deep fractures within Putin's power structure. But Prigozhin proved today that he remains both capable and willing to exploit those fractures. His forces moved not only swiftly, they moved so precisely that they encountered virtually no resistance for over 500 kilometers. That distance matters because it shows complete operational planning. It shows that Prigozhin is not merely a disgruntled mercenary leader. He is a strategic actor with real military capability. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Wagner's operation. Wagner armored columns advanced to within 200 kilometers of Moscow, forcing civilian evacuations and road closures. Wagner units targeted military airfields that had been reinforced in the last 72 hours. Wagner forces operating near Voronezh reportedly disabled Russian military helicopters used to coordinate defensive operations. This wasn't just a protest. This wasn't just a negotiating tactic. This was an armed insurrection. This was a direct march on the Russian capital. And a direct march on the capital is the one thing Putin has struggled to even imagine since taking power over 2 decades ago. For every show of strength Putin has made, Prigozhin has countered with something that exposes the underlying weakness. See, remember, Putin thought Wagner would remain a loyal tool of Russian foreign policy. He thought Prigozhin would accept his subordinate role indefinitely. He thought the Russian military would unite against any internal threat. But tonight, the exact opposite happened. Wagner turned against Moscow. Prigozhin demanded the removal of Russia's top military leaders. And the Russian military watched without intervening. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Prigozhin's mutiny happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary pressure. Military hardliners want escalation in Ukraine. Economic pragmatists want negotiated settlements. Regional governors want more resources and autonomy. Russian citizens want the war to end. Putin is balancing these demands while losing ground in Ukraine and facing mounting casualties. And when leaders in that position face sudden internal challenges, they're not responding from strength. They're responding from vulnerability. They're responding from desperation. The Kremlin's statement, now broadcast across state media, was designed to signal that Putin will not tolerate armed rebellion. Officials said plainly that Prigozhin's actions were a stab in the back and would be punished. That is Kremlin language for, "We are terrified and buying time." You don't usually hear that tone from Moscow unless something genuinely existential is at stake. Meanwhile, Putin addressed the nation in a tense, visibly shaken speech tonight. He said, "Those who organized this mutiny have betrayed Russia." He said, "They will face inevitable punishment." And he said, "The unity of our nation is our greatest strength." These are not confident statements. These are statements from a leader who understands just how close his power came to crumbling. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. So Prigozhin's march wasn't isolated. Along with the advance toward Moscow, Wagner-affiliated media channels amplified calls for Shoigu's removal. Russian military bloggers openly supported Prigozhin's grievances. Regional security forces reportedly remained neutral rather than opposing Wagner. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When multiple power centers fail to support the Kremlin simultaneously, it means something larger is fracturing. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Prigozhin is preparing to negotiate a new power-sharing arrangement. Another is that Prigozhin is attempting to force personnel changes in military leadership. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Prigozhin has exposed irreparable fractures that others will now exploit. But today, someone blinked. They didn't continue the march. They didn't storm Moscow. They didn't force the ultimate confrontation. They accepted a deal brokered by Belarus. What we're watching now is a test of Putin's authority. Prigozhin wants to see whether Putin can survive this humiliation. Putin wants to show this rebellion has been contained. Western allies want to understand whether Russia is fracturing. And Ukraine wants to exploit whatever chaos emerges. So tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Wagner's withdrawal toward Belarus. They say the immediate crisis appears to be pausing. They say negotiations resulted in criminal charges against Prigozhin being dropped. And they say Putin's decision to negotiate rather than fight is likely part of a survival strategy intended to buy time. But Prigozhin is not defeated. In fact, Prigozhin is emboldened. His march today, bold, calculated, and devastating to Putin's image, sent a message to the Kremlin that the old rules no longer apply, and it sent a message to the world that Russia's power structure is far weaker than anyone imagined. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Prigozhin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that today's events were historic. They exposed Putin's vulnerability. They demonstrated fractures in Russian military command. And they changed the calculus of this war permanently. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he retaliates, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of Russia's internal collapse. If he accepts humiliation, rivals have already seen that Putin can be challenged. They have seen that armed rebellion is possible. And tonight, for the first time in 23 years, Vladimir Putin appears to be genuinely afraid. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully, because tonight Putin learned something he has never experienced before. His power has limits, his military is divided, and his grip on Russia is no longer absolute. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear. The myth of Putin's invincibility has shattered. The fractures within Russia have been exposed, and the consequences will reshape this conflict forever. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.